Hey guys. Tonight we drift into the eerie world of 18th century slave ships, where time passed slowly and horrors never slept. Picture this. The sea is endless and black, the creaking of wooden planks never stops, and the stench of sweat, salt, and sorrow clings to every inch of the ship. Sailors pace the deck above, while hundreds of enslaved souls suffer in chains below. It's hot, it's cramped, and if you're lucky, the rats only nibble your boots and not your toes. The sea doesn't care if you're bored, it just keeps rolling. 4 sailors on slave ships, days melted together in a haze of monotony and misery. And if you think your 12-hour shift is long, try pulling a 4-hour watch twice a day with barely any rest and 0 coffee, the only breaks. Maybe a brawl, maybe a whipping, maybe a tropical disease, picking a new victim. You probably won't survive this, but these men did. Or at least, some of them did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is over there. I always read those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with the ship itself, a beast of timber and iron, packed too tight with bodies and fear. Above deck, life for the sailors wasn't exactly luxury. Most of them slept in hammocks, swinging like carcasses between damp beams. The space was small, the smells were large, and privacy didn't exist. You could hear everything from the loud groans of the sea to the soft cries rising from the lower deck. And yes, some sailors claimed they could hear the ship whisper. Below deck, the enslaved were shackled, stacked, and silenced. But that's for later. Tonight, we start topside, where sailors tried to keep their minds from unraveling. Every day was the same. Rope work, orders barked, salt sores flaring up again, and always that sun hot enough to bake a man's scalp through his hat. At night, it didn't get better. Sleep was broken into short, restless chunks. One moment you were dreaming of land, the next you were hauling ropes in a storm. Lightning lit up the ship like a ghost lantern. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. And still, the ship sailed on, night after endless night. Historians still argue whether boredom or fear was worse for these sailors. Some went mad, others just went quiet. Either way, time passed, but not kindly. The ship never truly slept, even when darkness fell and most of the crew lay tangled in hammocks or slumped on barrels. The ocean didn't stop moving, and neither did the ship. Every groan of the hull, every flap of the sails, every sudden crash of a loose bucket kept nerves tight and sleep light. And then there were the bells. Always the bells. Bells were the ship's heartbeat, not chiming for beauty, but for command. A bell every half hour, every change of the watch, every shift in the routine. Time was chopped into 4-hour blocks, and each sailor knew his turn was coming again far too soon. You'd just drift off dreaming of food that wasn't salted pork, and the bell would scream your name back into reality. Welcome to the midnight watch. And on slave ships, the night was the hardest. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't. Chains below deck clinked softly, like whispers through metal. Some sailors claimed they saw faces in the dark, silent eyes, watching from corners. But they never said much. Saying too much got you noticed. Getting noticed got you punished. Keeping order was a constant job. The officers were strict, but the ocean was stricter. If you slipped or lagged or fell asleep on watch, the punishment was swift. Sometimes a rope's end to the back, sometimes worse. Sometimes nothing at all, just a cold stare that said, "Try it again." Still, the crew found strange comforts. Some liked the rhythmic creak of the hull, the slosh of the waves. They claimed it soothed them, like a lullaby sung by a monster. Others took comfort in the stars. Mapping constellations gave them a feeling of control. It was nonsense, of course, but what else could you do, stuck between sky and sea? Quirkier sailors gave names to every rat and seagull they saw. One man claimed a gull followed him from ship to ship. "It's my mother-in-law reincarnated," he said. Nobody laughed too hard. Superstition ran deep, and mocking it brought bad luck. At least that's what the cook insisted. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were pure delusion or coping strategies for a deeply unnatural life. But for the men afloat in the middle of nowhere, belief was often all they had. And so the ship moved forward, endlessly forward, toward ports none of the sailors wanted to see, with cargo none of them wanted to touch. But between orders and fear, they made time to survive, by rituals, by routine, and by pretending, just for a moment, that the sea wasn't watching. Time didn't tick on these ships, it clanged. There were no clocks, no ticking hands, no alarms, just bells. Brass bells mounted near the helm, their ringing dividing the endless day and night into slices small enough to survive. It was a rhythm sailors trusted more than the sun. After all, clouds could lie, but the bells, they never missed a beat. Each watch lasted for hours, and there were 6 in every day. The names sounded like strange spells: middle watch, morning watch, first dog watch. Sailors rotated through them, meaning sleep came in fragments. 1 hour here to there. Most never saw a full night's rest. Not once, not in months. The bells rang every half hour to mark the passage of time. 1 bell, then 2, then 3, up to 8. Then it started over. Simple, right? Except not really. The dog watch was split into 2 parts to rotate the crew and avoid the same men pulling the same hours every day. It kept things fair, they said, which was rich, considering everything else happening aboard. Between those clangs, sailors lived their tiny lives. They'd sneak bites of biscuit, sharpen knives that didn't need sharpening, or just stare at the sea like it owed them something. The lucky ones had a job on deck that gave them some air and light. The unlucky ones, they were sent below, where breath turned sour and the walls wept with sweat. In their spare time, if you could call it, that some men made games out of counting the bells, guessing when the next ring would come. Others played a twisted kind of bingo, betting on when a storm would hit or when someone would get punished. The stakes weren't high because no one had anything to lose. One rare oddball built a sundial out of bones and string, trying to rival the ship's bell system. It didn't work, but he carried it everywhere like it was gold. No one told him to stop. Maybe they knew he needed it. Historians still argue whether the bell system brought comfort or monotony. It gave structure, sure, but also constant reminders that time was crawling, not flying. The sea had no mercy for impatience. A day might stretch for eternity, but that clang meant time hadn't stopped. It was still moving, and if time could move, maybe they could too. When the work was done, or at least done enough, the sailors needed something, anything, to keep their minds from falling into the sea. That's where games came in, not fancy ones. No colorful boards or neat instructions. Just a battered deck of cards, some dice chipped from bone or scrap wood, and rules that changed depending on who was winning. Card games were a favorite, not because everyone loved them, but because cards fit in a pocket and could be played with greasy fingers. All fours was common, as was Lanterloo, games filled with trick-taking and side bets. But honestly, most sailors barely remembered the rules. If the cards got slapped down hard enough and there was shouting, it counted as fun. Dice were louder. That clatter across the deck had a certain musical panic to it. Sailors would bet on anything: how long till the next storm, whether the cook would drop the stew, if old Jim would finally fall asleep standing up again. One time, a man bet his last pair of trousers. He lost, spent the next week in a sailcloth kilt. He said it was liberating. No one sat near him. The stakes were rarely big because nobody had much. A scrap of tobacco, a piece of salted meat, maybe a carved trinket. It wasn't about the prize, it was about the escape. For those few minutes, they weren't trapped on a floating coffin. They were in a game. And in games, anything could happen. Of course, not all games stayed friendly. Fists flew. Knives sometimes appeared. More than once, a cheating accusation ended with a man overboard, or so the whispers claimed. Officially, those sailors fell. Some captains banned games altogether, said they led to sin, but most turned a blind eye. Better angry men shouting over dice than whispering in corners about mutiny. A fringe favorite was coin drop. You'd hold a coin to your forehead. Simple, dumb, hilarious, especially when rum was involved. One man got so good at it, they called him Dead-Eye Penny. He bragged endlessly, until someone nailed the tankard to the ceiling. Historians still argue whether these games were innocent or dangerous distractions. They certainly blurred the line between play and fight, but they gave shape to hours that otherwise stretched like taffy. And so, with cards clacking and dice rolling, the sailors held boredom at bay, one noisy, ridiculous moment at a time. When the games grew old and the hands too tired, stories took over. Long, winding tales told in low voices beneath the creak of the rigging. Some were jokes, raunchy, ridiculous, full of impossible escapades with mermaids or stolen gold. Others, not so funny. Ghosts, sea monsters, ships that vanished into mist, never to return. The best storytellers weren't always the loudest. Often it was the quiet, scruffy ones, the men who sat cross-legged on barrels, whittling scraps of wood and spinning yarns between their teeth. One could mimic voices so well, the other swore he was possessed. Another claimed he once arm-wrestled a shark. Nobody believed him. Not until he showed a crescent-shaped scar on his thigh. Even then, probably a cannon splinter. But still, by the ship's dim lanterns, stories became movies in the mind. There was no other entertainment, no books, no music, no screens, just voices and imagination, bending boredom into something almost beautiful. Many tales circled around places none of them had seen. Cities full of red lanterns and golden coins. Forests where fruit fell from the trees. Women who could fly, and islands that granted wishes if you left your boots behind. And then, of course, there were the horror tales. Every crew had their favorite, the screaming wind that drove sailors mad, the ship cursed to sail forever, never docking, its crew all skeletons, still pulling the ropes, or the ghost boy who appeared just before a storm. One sailor swore he saw him standing at the bow in the moonlight, pointing toward something none of them wanted to meet. Historians still argue whether these stories were shared culture or clever control used by officers to keep men too scared to sneak below deck or abandon post, but they stuck. Even long after voyages ended, sailors carried them home like souvenirs, passed them to children, neighbors, anyone who'd listen. The stories didn't just fill time, they built identity. You weren't just a man on a ship. You were the one who'd seen the ghost fog, or the one who knew a man who fought a giant squid with a broken oar. And even if none of it was true, well, truth was always negotiable out at sea. Idle hands were dangerous at sea. That's why so many sailors took to carving. Whittling was quiet, steady, and weirdly soothing. With nothing but a pocket knife and a piece of scrap wood, they'd shape the hours into little totems, lucky charms, or small, grotesque faces, some smiling, some screaming. It gave them something to hold, something real, in a world made of shifting decks and slippery morals. A popular item: miniature ships, detailed, delicate little models with tiny sails and rigging. Some sailors carved them from old barrel staves. Others preferred bone, even ivory if they could get their hands on it. One man shaped a perfect little brig from a whale's tooth, showed it off like it was treasure. It was stolen within the week. Carving wasn't just art, it was ritual, a way to pass time, calm nerves, and sometimes to tell silent stories. Some men scratched names into their carvings of wives, children, or people they'd never see again. One sailor carved the same woman's face over and over. When asked who she was, he just said, "Not mine anymore." Superstition wove through the practice, too. Some figures were meant to ward off storms. Others were watchers, little guardians, hung near hammocks or tucked in shirt pockets. A few even carved protective symbols directly into the ship's wood, right under the officers' noses. Didn't matter if it worked, it felt like control. Sometimes the carvings turned dark, figures in chains, faces screaming, tiny coffins, a mirror of what they saw tried not to see below deck. That's when the officers usually stepped in, confiscating what they called morbid distractions. But the sailors always made more. One strange tale tells of a sailor who carved the entire voyage into a single beam storm. Sunrise, shackled men, rats, fights, and all. It was hidden under his hammock. When he died, no one touched it. The crew said it was cursed. The captain had it burned. The fire wouldn't catch for nearly an hour. Historians still argue whether sailor carvings were crude art or secret confession. Maybe both, maybe neither. But those tiny figures told truths the sailors couldn't say out loud. And even as the ship rocked on through blistering days and sleepless nights, blades kept scraping wood, little shavings fluttering down like flakes of stolen time. Some nights, the ship itself seemed to hum, and it wasn't just the wind and the sails or the groan of old ropes, it was voices, dozens of them, rising from the depths or drifting down from the rigging, singing. Sea shanties weren't just background noise, they were tools, rhythmic, pounding, breath-stealing tools. These songs helped men heave sails, haul rope, scrub decks. They kept time better than any bell, and distracted from sore backs. But they were more than work songs. When the toil was done, shanties turned to entertainment, rebellion, and sometimes strange beauty. A sailor might start humming while peeling a potato. Another would chime in. Soon, a whole chorus echoed off the waves. The sea didn't care for harmony, but the men did their best. The lyrics, chaotic. One verse about a lost love, the next about punching a shark. They mixed truth, joke, and filth like a stew that somehow kept them sane. Some shanties were hundreds of years old, passed from ship to ship, mouth to ear. Others were made up on the spot songs that lived for one voyage, then vanished like foam. One curious case involved a shanty band on 3 ships in a row. Supposedly, every time it was sung, someone fell from the rigging within the hour. Coincidence, maybe, but the tune vanished, mostly. There were also quiet songs, soft, strange melodies from below deck. The enslaved, when not forced to dance for exercise, sometimes sang to each other in hushed tones, lullabies, chants, prayers. Sailors would pause to listen, not out of respect, but curiosity and, for some guilt they'd never admit. The sound was haunting, like sorrow itself had found a melody. Historians still argue whether music unified the crew or masked deeper divisions, but no one questions its power. On a ship where hours bled into days and laughter was often forced, song gave shape to the shapeless. And so the men sang, loud or low, clean or crude, to pass the time, to remember home, or just to forget where they were. Letters, tiny pieces of paper that held enormous weight on an 18th century slave ship. Writing a letter was like whispering into a storm, pointless, maybe, but it still mattered. Sailors didn't write often. Most couldn't, and those who could didn't always want to. What could you say anyway? Still alive, still floating, still pretending this is normal. When they did write, it was during rare stretches of calm. A scrap of parchment, a stub of charcoal or lead, bent over a barrel or the back of a crewmate. Ink was a luxury, so was privacy. Every word had to matter. No space for poetry, just the facts, or the lies. Dearest Mary, one sailor began, the sea treats me kindly. It didn't. He had lice, a festering wound, and nightmares he hadn't told a soul about. But that wasn't the sort of thing you wrote to your wife. Some wrote to parents, others to children. One man, every voyage, wrote a letter to a woman who'd left him years before. He never sent them, just folded each one carefully, tied it with string, and tucked it into a pouch he wore around his neck. When he died, the pouch held 17 letters. None had been opened. Mail drops were rare. If the ship stopped at a port with a friendly post office hand, if an officer allowed it to, might get your letter off, but most stayed in pockets or boxes, written, sealed, and forgotten. A kind of therapy, maybe, or a silent scream. There were other kinds of letters, too, angry ones. One sailor wrote a full page addressed to God himself, demanding an explanation for what was happening below deck. He burned it in a lantern flame afterward, said the smoke would carry it upward. Historians still argue whether sailor correspondence reveals more truth or more illusion. Letters were polished, shaped for imagined readers, but in their crooked lines and fading ink, something raw always slipped through. And so, even with trembling hands and aching backs, the men wrote words no one might ever see, just to feel like someone, somewhere, might still remember their name. When boredom tightened its grip too hard, fists flew. Sailors on slave ships didn't need a good reason to brawl, just a bad mood. A sideways glance, or someone breathing too loud near the rum barrel. Fights were part of the rhythm, like scrubbing the deck or trimming the sails. You could almost set your watch by them. Sometimes it was over cards or a missing sock. Sometimes it was something ancient and never explained. Two men might glare at each other for weeks, then explode into violence over spilled stew. And once it started, the rest of the crew didn't stop it. They watched, took bets, sometimes egged it on. One officer called it steam venting. Better they fight each other than turn on him, he figured. He wasn't wrong. The brawls varied. Some were short, loud, and stupid. A punch here, a shove there, maybe a tumble into a barrel. Others got ugly, teeth lost, noses broken, knives flashing briefly before someone thought better of it. And when a sailor crossed the line, discipline followed, tied to the mast, whipped, or denied food. One man was forced to scrub the deck with a broken hand for a week. It didn't teach him anything. He fought again 3 days later. Fighting also served as twisted entertainment. Duel Sundays. Some crews called them unofficial matches, where grudges were settled and pride bruised. Not sanctioned, of course, but rarely stopped. One sailor invented a scoring system. He kept a notebook full of names, wins, and losses. When he finally went overboard drunk, probably the notebook stayed behind. Someone picked it up and continued the record. Historians still argue whether this aggression was born from stress or just sailor culture. Maybe both. Isolation and tight quarters pressurized every emotion. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to cool off, so men boiled over, then got back to work. One oddball solution came from a captain who ordered a wrestling ring built from rope and barrels. Better bruised than bleeding, he said. For a while, it worked. Then someone lost an ear. Still, the fights served their purpose. A brief flash of chaos in a sea of repetition. A way to feel alive, even if it meant blacking out. And when it was over, the men wiped the blood, shared a drink, and returned to the ropes. No hard feelings, they'd say, until the next time. Mealtime on an 18th century slave ship was less dining experience and more survival test. The food, mostly gray, sometimes brown, always bland, or horrifyingly salty. It came in dented tins, burlap sacks, or big wooden barrels that smelled like damp socks. Sailors didn't eat to enjoy, they ate because not eating meant passing out at the top of the mast. The daily menu rarely changed. Salted meat so tough it doubled as a weapon. Hardtack biscuits that needed to be smashed with a hammer before chewing. Some men soaked them in brine just to soften them, and even then they might still contain weevils. Protein and crunch, all in one. Soup made a regular appearance. Thin, greasy, and questionable. One sailor claimed he found a toe in it. Probably a joke. Probably. Then there were the stranger snacks. Dried peas, often undercooked. Pickled cabbage when they were lucky. And rats. Yes, rats. Some men swore by them. Fresh meat, they'd say. Better than moldy beef. There was even a rat stew recipe passed around in whispers. Boil it twice. Add onions if you can steal some. Pray it wasn't already poisoned. Drinks, water was stored in barrels and went stale fast. Green with algae, sometimes. That's why beer and rum were treasured even, though they were weak, sour, or both. One sailor filtered his water through a sock. It didn't help, but he claimed it tasted like home. Mealtime was also story time, bet-settling time, and sometimes insult hour. If someone spilled stew, laughter echoed. If someone hoarded the biscuit bag, things got tense. Sharing wasn't a virtue, it was a strategy. You made friends at meals or made enemies. Sometimes both. The cook, usually the most hated man on board, always sweaty, always yelling, always blamed for stomach aches. But he had power. If he liked you, your portion might be bigger. If not, expect the bone scraps, or worse, nothing at all. Historians still argue whether sailors' diets were deliberately bad or just the best possible under awful circumstances. Either way, the result was the same: scurvy, weakness, and meals that haunted dreams. Still, the daily mess was something to look forward to. Not for flavor, but for rhythm. A pause in the day. A time to sit, joke, and pretend just briefly that you weren't drifting through hell on a plate of hardtack and despair. Cleaning the deck sounds innocent enough. A bucket of seawater, a stiff brush, a few salty laughs. But on an 18th century slave ship, holystoning the deck was anything but holy, and it was rarely about cleanliness. Each morning, just after the first light crept over the water, sailors were ordered to scrub the wooden planks from bow to stern. The stones used were rough, gritty, and got their name because the men had to kneel like they were in prayer while grinding them across the boards. Joints cracked, fingers bled, backs screamed, all for a deck that would be just as filthy by sunset. The officers claimed it was necessary to prevent rot and disease. Maybe it was. But it also broke spirits, a kind of ritual humiliation. Sailors hated it almost as much as storms, and that's saying something. Some days, holystoning took hours. Other days, it was rushed through just so officers could bark at someone or hand out lashes for slacking. And yes, punishment was tied tightly to this chore. If you angered the wrong man, you'd find yourself scrubbing the captain's quarters with a rag dipped in vinegar, bare hands only. One sailor was made to holystone the same patch of deck for 2 straight days. He said it taught him patience or madness. Same thing, really. Every now and then, the crew found creative ways to protest. They'd accidentally dump the dirty bucket water on officers' boots, or scratch obscene symbols into the wet deck with their stones. One man carved a smiley face so perfectly it took the captain 2 weeks to notice. He was flogged when he did. Holystoning was also used to erase bloodstains, vomit. Sometimes worse. It didn't purify, it concealed, and the men knew it. Every stain they scrubbed off reminded them of the ones that wouldn't go away. Historians still argue whether this daily scrubbing was a real sanitation practice or just psychological control. After all, if you keep a man busy enough, he won't have time to think about mutiny or morality. Still, they scrubbed, knees grinding into splinters, arms going numb, salt water biting into open skin. And all the while, the sea watched, unimpressed, as sailors cleaned a ship that refused to be clean. When knives weren't being used to whittle or fight, they were carving ink into skin. Tattooing was part distraction, part declaration, and fully painful. On 18th century slave ships, sailors didn't wait for shore leave to get inked. They did it right there, rocking with the waves, sweating through the sting, sometimes humming through gritted teeth to keep from yelling. The tools were crude: needles, pins, or sharpened bone. Ink came from soot, gunpowder, or even crushed rust mixed with spit or rum. Sanitation, not a thing. Getting a tattoo was a gamble. You might get a cool anchor on your forearm, or an infected mess that swelled like a rotten turnip. But they kept doing it because tattoos told stories. A swallow meant you'd sailed 1,000 nautical miles. A crucifix across the chest, just in case you drowned. So God knew who to save. One sailor tattooed Mother across his bicep in letters so shaky it looked like mudhar. He kept it anyway. Said it made her sound tougher. Matching tattoos were common, too. Brotherhood in ink. Men bonded by rope burns and bad soup would carve the same symbol into each other's arms. A dagger, a star. One group all got tiny pigs and roosters, believed to prevent drowning. The logic: those animals don't swim, so they'd supposedly float back to land. Sometimes tattoos got personal. One man etched tally marks down his thigh one for every port he visited. Another tattooed the name of every woman he loved. He ran out of space halfway down his forearm and just started adding initials. And then there were the strange ones. A full shark across a sailor's back. A skeleton rowing a boat. One man had a pair of eyes tattooed on his eyelids so that he'd always be watching. That one unsettled everyone. Historians still argue whether these tattoos were acts of defiance, tradition, or boredom-fueled madness. Probably all three. On slave ships, control was everything, and carving your own skin was one way to take some of it back. The officers didn't like it. But as long as the crew kept pulling ropes and scrubbing decks, the tattoos stayed. Some captains even had ink of their own hidden under collars, etched in a past they no longer spoke of. So, under flickering lanterns, with shaking hands and makeshift needles, the men marked their bodies. Proof they'd lived, at least for now. Proof they were still theirs. They weren't exactly invited, but they always showed up: rats and cats, stowaways with whiskers and claws. On an 18th century slave ship, animals weren't just tolerated, they became part of the strange, floating society. Some were pests, others became unofficial crewmates, and some, somehow, were both. Rats were everywhere. In the holds, in the hammocks, under barrels. They gnawed through sacks of grain, chewed on boots, and made midnight chewing sounds that could drive a man to madness. Sailors cursed them, chased them, sometimes even tried to trap them, but they also watched them, studied them. Rats, oddly enough, were considered lucky if you believed the old sailors' tales. If the rats are calm, the storm will pass, one man said. Another insisted that if rats started fleeing the ship, it meant the voyage was cursed. No one wanted to believe in rat prophecy until they started acting strange. Still, desperation made things weird. Some sailors trained the rats, gave them names, fed them scraps. One rat, dubbed Admiral Squeak, was said to follow the bosun around like a dog. The men even carved a tiny wooden medal for it. When it died crushed by a falling crate, 3 sailors held a funeral and sang. The captain was not amused, but the cats, they had real jobs. Brought aboard to control the rat population. They slinked through the ship like silent supervisors. Some were friendly, curling up in hammocks beside exhausted sailors. Others were aloof and slightly terrifying, especially the black one they called Pitch. It appeared in every storm and disappeared just as fast. Superstition clung to that cat like barnacles to the hull. A few sailors swore the cats could sense things. One sat on a man's chest for a whole night. He died the next morning. Coincidence? Sure. But that cat got extra fish from then on. Of course, not all officers liked having animals on board. They were dirty, unpredictable, and sometimes bit. But the crew often protected them anyway. One man threw a fit when an officer tried to toss his rat companion overboard. "That rat's been with me longer than my last wife," he shouted. It didn't help. The rat got tossed. So did the sailor, 2 days later, for insubordination. Historians still argue whether animal companionship helped morale or just added more chaos. Either way, those four-legged misfits were a part of ship life, scurrying through nightmares and naps alike. And so, alongside chains and chants, sails and storms, there were always claws clicking on wood, tiny eyes gleaming in the dark, watching the sailors survive another day. There weren't many windows on a slave ship, just endless sky above and an ocean that refused to blink. But sailors became expert watchers of both, especially the sky, especially the weather. Because when you're floating between continents on a wooden coffin, clouds can become everything. Weather watching wasn't just sins, it was obsession, superstition, and sometimes entertainment. Sailors would point out strange cloud shapes, whisper warnings, or spin tales around a shifting wind. A red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight. They clung to those rhymes like lifelines, even when they didn't hold up. Storms were the real performers. You'd hear it before you saw it thunder, like distant drums, wind turning the sails into screaming sheets. Some men feared storms more than mutiny. Others welcomed them like a change of pace. "At least it's not boring," one sailor said, as lightning cracked the mast. Between storms, the sea could be eerily calm. Days without wind, called the doldrums, could stretch forever. The ship wouldn't move. The sails would droop like dead wings. Men would lie on deck, sweat pooling in their ears, watching the sky for any sign of a breeze. Just a whisper of wind could bring hope or dread. One sailor swore he could smell storms. Another said the clouds spoke to him in sleep. Nobody laughed too hard. Out here, strange beliefs stuck around, like the idea that if you whistled into the wind, you could summon a squall. Or if you stabbed a knife into the mainmast during calm, the gods of wind would answer, though sometimes not kindly. Some even believed certain birds predicted storms. Albatross sightings meant changing weather. Gulls circling the ship too low. Bad omen. One ship's crew blamed a single parrot for attracting a cyclone. It wasn't even theirs. It flew in from another ship. They threw it overboard. The storm still came. Historians still argue whether lore was based in observation or pure desperation. Likely both. When all you have is the sky and the sea, patterns emerge, whether real or imagined. So, with narrowed eyes and sunburnt necks, the sailors stared upward, reading clouds like maps, following winds like whispers, hoping the heavens were in a good mood for once. Not every spectacle at sea came from the sky. Sometimes the sailors made their own. One of the strangest forms of entertainment aboard slave ships was the mock trial, a bizarre blend of theater, punishment, and very dark comedy. It usually started with a slow day, when the wind died down or duties had thinned. Boredom would rise like smoke. Then someone, usually the loudest or the drunkest, would shout, "Court's in session." That was the cue. A barrel became the judge's bench. A mop became a wig. And suddenly, the ship was a courtroom. The accused, always a crewmate, often chosen for something ridiculous, snoring too loudly, stealing an extra biscuit, or looking like a haunted boot. No one was safe. The more absurd the charge, the better the laughs. The trial followed its own logic. There was a prosecutor, a defender, and lots of shouting. Witnesses were made up on the spot. One sailor was once accused of consorting with sea witches. His defense: "They consorted with me first." The judge banged his mug on the deck and declared him guilty of charm. Sentence: 3 spoonfuls of vinegar and a sock to the face. It was meant to be fun, but sometimes things went sideways. Jokes cut too deep. A fake sentence felt a little too real. One mock trial ended with the accused leaping into the sea. He was fished out, but the court was disbanded for a while. Some captains hated the practice, said it bred disrespect. Others let it happen, believing it eased tensions. And maybe it did. A chance to flip the ship's hierarchy, if only for an hour. The grumpiest officer might be dragged into it forced to defend himself for crimes against good stew. Historians still argue whether these trials were harmless role-play or dangerous venting. On ships where real justice was scarce and cruelty was routine, the lines blurred quickly. But the sailors relished the game. They'd carve tiny gavels. One crew made a powdered wig out of rope threads and rat fur. It was horrifying and beloved. For a moment, the ship became a stage, the sea an audience. And laughter, however strained, bounced off the wood like a protest in disguise. He was barber. He was surgeon. He was the man with the blade and almost no formal training. On an 18th century slave ship, the barber surgeon wasn't just a character. He was a terrifying necessity. Equal parts healer, butcher, and stand-up act. Every ship had one, or someone pretending to be one. Their tools fit in a box: rusty saws, clamps, a needle and thread, maybe a jar of leeches. There was always a bottle of rum, not for disinfecting, though sometimes it helped, but for the patient, or the surgeon, or both. To pass the time and maybe chase away fear, the barber surgeon would put on a bit of a show. When someone needed a tooth pulled or a limb lanced, he didn't do it in silence. No, he'd narrate like a street performer. "Now, hold still, lest I make you shorter than you planned to be," he'd joke, while prepping a blade that hadn't seen soap in weeks. The crew would gather like it was theater. They'd lean in, wide-eyed, not sure if they were about to laugh, faint, or run. A tooth extraction might come with a full commentary. Here lies the molar, brave and strong, but treasonous to the gums. But the fun only went so far. Sometimes things got real. A bad fall from the rigging, a deep cut from a snapped rope, an infection from a tattoo that turned green overnight. That's when the jokes stopped, the saw came out, and the screaming began. Amputations were grim. No anesthetic, no clean linens, and certainly no gentle bedside manner. The saw sang its short, horrible song, and if the man lived, they considered it a win. If not, well, the sea always had room. Some barber surgeons were better than others. One was said to be so steady-handed he could cut a rope from 10 feet with a knife toss. Another lost more patience than he saved, but had such a good singing voice, no one complained until it was their turn. Historians still argue whether these medical performers were brave improvisers or dangerous fools. Either way, they were vital. You couldn't run a ship without someone to stitch a gut, set a bone, or stop a bleeding head. And so, amid the blood and laughter, the barber surgeon did his work. His jokes cut deeper than his blades. But sometimes, that made the pain just a little easier to bear. On a slave ship, it was about survival, sanity, and a little bit of rebellion. Sailors made statements with whatever scraps they could find. Mismatched buttons, patched trousers, hats too big or too small. It was chaos, but deliberate chaos, and strangely, it worked. But after weeks at sea, everything wore thin, tore, or rotted. So they improvised. One man sewed old sailcloth into a pair of trousers. Another turned a ratty net into a belt. Practical, barely, stylish, absolutely not, but personal, definitely. Hats were status, identity, and sometimes the only clean thing a sailor owned. Some men stole them from sleeping crewmates. Others stitched them from rags and rope. One bold sailor wore a seagull feather in his cap, said it was for luck and speed. It didn't help his luck, but it made him easy to spot during brawls. Then there were the accessories: teeth strung like beads, bone earrings, rope bracelets dyed with rust. One man wore a spoon around his neck, claimed it had saved his life once. How? He never explained. Some even painted their nails with tar, called it stormproofing. A grumpy cook who mocked any sailor with a tear bigger than a fist. An officer who made fun of color clashes, despite always wearing mismatched socks. Everyone noticed. No one said it out loud, like the sailor who wore a kilt made from striped hammock cloth, or the one who tied knives to his boots not for combat, but for flair. He called it his iron kick. Either way, each choice, every patch, knot and frayed, not from luxury, but from scraps. Each garment a little protest, a little joke, a little piece of themselves that hadn't been claimed by the sea. If a sock went missing on a slave ship, it wasn't the wind. It was probably the man in the next hammock. Petty theft was part of the daily rhythm, as natural as tying knots or swearing at the weather. Sailors stole because they were bored, because they were hungry, or simply because it was something to do. But it wasn't always malicious. Sometimes stealing was how friendships started. One man borrowed another's blanket for a week, then returned it with a stitched-on patch shaped like a heart, a strange apology, sure but accepted. Other times, theft led to chaos. One sailor stole someone's pipe, and the entire forecastle nearly burned down when the crew tried to smoke him out literally. Theft wasn't the only trick up their sleeves. Pranks were a kind of currency, a way to pass time, stir the pot, and test boundaries. Buckets of seawater accidentally dumped into hammocks, greased ropes that slipped through hands at the worst moment. One crew once convinced a rookie sailor that the ship had a ghost named Captain Cough. They'd fake hacking sounds at night and swear he was coming up from the hold. The poor man didn't sleep for 5 days. Some pranks were more elaborate. Fake letters from port authorities, messages written in soap on sleeping men's foreheads. A few pranksters had flair. One sailor trained a rat to sit still in a boot. Then he placed the boot at the top of the ladder, knowing full well what would happen when someone tried to put it on. Screams, laughter, and one twisted ankle followed. Of course, not everyone appreciated the jokes. Officers generally frowned on disruptive behavior, but most turned a blind eye unless it interfered with work. Even they knew A little mischief kept the crew from boiling over. There were limits. A prank that endangered the ship or crew crossed the line. One sailor was nearly keel-hauled after pretending to be swept overboard just to see how fast the crew could react. They were fast and furious. Historians still argue whether sailor pranks were clever coping or desperate distraction. Either way, they broke the monotony, even if only for a moment. So, while the sea stretched silent and grim, the sailors schemed. They stole buttons, hid hammocks, swapped boots, and convinced each other of the wildest things, because sometimes a good laugh was all they had to keep the darkness at bay. Hidden below deck, tucked behind barrels, or bundled under damp hammocks, were little books that no one was supposed to see. Journals, diaries, private scribbles on crumpled scraps of paper, stitched leather, or old sailcloth. They weren't official records. They weren't neat, but they told the truth, or at least a version of it. Not every sailor could write, but those who could often did, quietly, secretly, during night watch, or when the others were too busy fighting or sleeping to notice. A stub of charcoal, a broken pencil, sometimes just a splinter, dipped in rum and soot. Words etched into silence. These weren't logs of the sea and stars. They were the bleeding edges of memory. Saw him whipped today, one entry read. Didn't flinch. I did. Another sailor wrote, only in code dots and dashes. No one could crack, even after he died. Some used poetry. Some used curses. One journal was nothing but names, just names, page after page, until it ran out of room. The officers hated these diaries. They feared them. Some confiscated and burned any they found. Subversive, they said. Private thoughts make dangerous men. And maybe they were right. One sailor was flogged after his journal was discovered. It described the screams from below deck in harrowing detail. He'd drawn sketches, 2 of chains of wounds. The captain read it aloud to the crew as punishment. Then he tore it up and scattered it into the sea. But the men remembered every word. Others were more careful. They hid their pages inside boots, stitched them into clothing, or kept them folded inside carved wooden boxes. A few even buried them in the ship itself, wedged between beams, sealed in tar, as if hoping the wood would one day speak for them. Historians still argue whether these journals were accurate or exaggerated. But what's undeniable is that they carried emotional truth, pain pressed into paragraphs, guilt folded between lines, silence broken, one shaky letter at a time. And though most of these writings never reached shore, the act of writing itself was a kind of resistance, a quiet defiance, a whisper that said, I saw, I knew, I was here. So while the ship groaned on, while men sang and fought and carved their names into decks, a few simply wrote, trying to trap memory, trying to stay human. It always felt colder below deck, not because of the sea air or the damp wood, but because of what people whispered about the hold. Even the bravest sailors hesitated to go down alone. Some said it was the darkness. Others said it was something darker. They called them ghosts, spirits, echoes, whatever the name. The feeling was the same eyes watching footsteps behind you that weren't there. Sailors claimed to hear whispers in languages they didn't speak, chains rattling when everything was still. A sudden draft brushing past their necks like a breath from something long dead. One man swore he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hold, half shadow, half light, unmoving. He lit a lantern, blinked, and it was gone. Another described a handprint on the inside of the hull upside down, and far too small. Every ship had its own legends. A child's laugh echoing from the bow. A ghostly bell that rang even when it wasn't hung. Doors swinging open on calm seas. One officer, usually hard as iron, refused to sleep near the main hatch after claiming he saw a woman in white standing on the stairs. She didn't blink, he said, didn't move, just watched. Skeptics called it tricks of the mind, boredom mixed with bad food and worse rum, and sure, hallucinations weren't rare, especially during long nights and longer voyages. But even the skeptics didn't walk the lower deck alone if they could help it. Some sailors left offerings, bits of biscuit, a coin. One man carved tiny crosses into the walls, muttering prayers in a language nobody understood. Another whistled softly whenever he passed the lower hatch, claiming the ghosts liked music. Historians still argue whether these ghost stories were born of guilt, imagination, or deeper cultural memory. After all, the hold wasn't just dark, it held pain, suffering soaked into the beams, screams swallowed by the sea. Perhaps the past didn't rest easy. Whatever the reason, the crew kept their eyes down and their voices low when talking about the shadows below. Laughter stopped at the top of the stairs. Even footsteps grew careful. Because on a ship that never truly slept, some things, some beings, might never have left at all. It was called dancing, but no one was smiling. Below deck, among the chains and shadows, enslaved people were forced to move not for celebration, but for control. The officers called it exercise. The crew called it jumping the slaves. It was brutal. It was terrifying. And it was daily. Each morning, hatches creaked open, and sunlight tore something like it filtered into the hold. The enslaved were unshackled in groups and brought above deck there, surrounded by armed sailors. They were ordered to jump, twist, stomp, sway. Music played from a rough fiddle or a beating drum. The rhythm was fast. The tone was cruel. The idea was to keep them healthy, keep their legs strong, prevent muscle decay. But it wasn't about carrot, it was about keeping them alive just long enough to sell. The movement wasn't free. It was demanded, enforced, and punished when not done properly. Some collapsed, others moved mechanically, eyes hollow, and some found rhythm. Not because they wanted to, but because moving with control felt like the only control they had left. A silent protest, a flicker of dignity. Sailors were sometimes ordered to oversee the dancing. It made many of them uncomfortable, though few spoke up. One man reportedly turned his back each time, staring at the mast with clenched fists. Another played the drum with tears in his eyes, claiming it was just noise, not music. No one corrected him. The enslaved themselves found ways to resist, even in the dance, shifting movements into coded messages, making steps too subtle to be punished, but too specific to be missed by others. A foot stomp meaning soon, a twist meaning together, a pattern that whispered, "We remember who we are." Historians still argue whether this forced dancing helped preserve health or only masked trauma. But the emotional toll was undeniable. Forcing people to move to music while shackled and watched. It wasn't exercise, it was theater. And everyone on that deck knew it. When the dance ended, they were returned below, sweating and silent, chained once more in the dark. The music faded. The deck was scrubbed. but the echo of footfalls lingered. And for the sailors, those echoes haunted the ship as much as any ghost ever could. Music was meant to lift spirits, but on a slave ship, it often did the opposite. The tunes that filled the deck weren't polished or joyful. They were jagged, awkward, and sometimes heartbreaking, played by reluctant musicians on instruments barely held together. The music was more noise than melody, but it was still a presence, a sound in the silence. Ships often carried fiddles, drums, or makeshift flutes, not for the sailors, but for the enslaved. Officers believed that music encouraged obedience, boosted morale, and made the enslaved dance more willingly. Willingly, of course, being a cruel illusion. The musicians were usually chosen from the crew, or, sometimes, from among the enslaved themselves. If you could keep a rhythm, you were handed an instrument and told to play. Whether your fingers were bleeding or your heart was breaking didn't matter. The music had to go on. One sailor played the same 3 notes on a squeaky fiddle for weeks. He wasn't good, he didn't want to be, but it kept him away from other jobs. Another used a drum made from a cracked barrel and stretched sailcloth. Every beat sounded like a heartbeat in panic. There was a man who carved a flute from bono body, asked whose the sound was sharp, eerie, like wind through broken teeth. A sailor once said it was the only honest sound he'd heard on the entire voyage. Most of the songs were forced orders, barked between bars. A tavern jig, a hymn so quiet it barely reached the deck. Those moments cracked through the tension like lightning through clouds. Still, the instruments suffered. Strings snapped, drums tore. The salty air chewed through wood and wire. Some sailors claimed the instruments groaned when played, as if tired of their own sounds. The music wasn't joyful. It was tired, reluctant, like everything else on board. Historians still argue whether these sounds offered comfort or simply filled uncomfortable silence. Maybe both. Music, even bad music, gave shape to time, gave voice to the voiceless, if only briefly. Or maybe it was just noise, echoing across a sea that refused to care. But it played on, a fiddle that screeched, a drum that muttered, and sometimes footsteps that followed the rhythm not by choice, but by force. They moved in silence, not always with their bodies, but with their minds, their eyes, their presence. The enslaved on board weren't just victims, they were resistors. And while the chains rattled and the orders echoed, resistance simmered beneath the surface like a slow, burning fire. It wasn't the kind of rebellion the officers feared, no riots or uprisings, not with so many guns trained on them, so many eyes watching. But resistance came in subtler forms, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, refusing to dance, even when it meant pain. Sometimes it was a stare that wouldn't break, a name held close and never shared, an identity clutched tight when everything else had been stripped away. They communicated in fragments, glances, hummed phrases, fingertips brushing during exercise. They built secret languages from familiar sounds. They passed messages in songs the sailors didn't understand. And through it all, they remembered where they came from, who they were, who they refused to become. One woman, never named in any journal, just referred to as her, refused food for 8 days. The crew whispered that she was choosing her own death, but she didn't die. On the 9th day, she spoke a single word to a sailor. He never said what it was, but he left the ship at the next port and never returned. Others resisted through memory. One man carved symbols into the walls of the hold with a fingernail worn to the bone. Another braided hair into patterns that meant something back home. A kind of map, maybe, a code. No one knew for sure, but they did it anyway. Every braid, every scratch, every whisper was an act of rebellion. And then there was refusal, a kind of quiet, profound refusal to give the captors anything more than obedience on the surface. Behind their eyes burned something unbroken. Sailors who looked too long often looked away. There was something there that made even the cruelest men uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether these forms of resistance were organized or spontaneous, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that resistance existed. It lived in shackled hands and silent defiance. It thrived in darkness because it had to. So while the ship rolled forward, while orders barked and drums thumped, something else moved beneath it, all something strong, quiet, and wholly determined not to vanish. The night watch was where the mind played its cruelest tricks, staring into darkness for hours, with only creaking ropes and the hush of waves for company, could bend reality into something strange. You weren't just tired. You were drifting between waking and dreaming, caught in a world where shadows breathed and memories whispered in languages they were never spoken in. Sailors rotated through the watch, 4 hours of pacing, listening, scanning the endless black horizon. It wasn't physically demanding, but mentally brutal. The brain, starved of stimulation and sleep, began to make things up. Figures walking across the water, a face in the sails, distant voices calling from the sea. One sailor claimed he saw his mother who'd been dead for 10 years, waving at him from the crow's nest. Another saw a glowing man climbing up from the waves, smiling. No one else did. He wouldn't talk for 3 days after. The most feared vision was the sea woman, pale, dripping, eyes too wide, said to hover near the stern just before someone died. Some sailors claimed they saw her every voyage. Some said she lived in the bilge, humming songs only the mad could hear. One man swore she whispered his name. He threw himself overboard before sunrise. And yet, not all hallucinations were terrifying. Some were gentle. A familiar smell on the wind, a glowing bird perched on the mast, a child's laughter that soothed more than startled. The mind, desperate for comfort, gave gifts as well as nightmares. Some sailors coped by talking to the dark, telling jokes to the mast, confessing secrets to the moon. One swore the stars blinked back in Morse code. He began charting messages, mostly gibberish, but a few made sense. Or so he said. Rum didn't help. It dulled the fear, but sharpened the edges of whatever the mind was brewing. Sailors began to recognize who was close to the edge. The man who laughed too loudly at nothing. The one who blinked too often. The one who flinched at shadows shaped like sails. Historians still argue whether these night visions were true hallucinations or expressions of deeper trauma emotions, too twisted to speak aloud. But everyone agrees, Night Watch changed a man. So, under the stars, eyes red with exhaustion, the sailors kept watch for storms, for ships, for things no one else could see and, maybe, just maybe, shouldn't have. No one said it out loud, but sometimes the sailors hoped for pirates. Not because pirates were kind, they weren't. They could be just as brutal, just as greedy, and sometimes worse. But they brought disruption, chaos, a reset. And on a slave ship, stuck in routine and rot, even danger felt like a kind of freedom. The threat of pirates was constant, especially near the Caribbean or West African coast. Lookouts scanned the horizon for ships flying the wrong flags or no flags at all. A sleek silhouette, unfamiliar sails, the wrong kind of silence. That's when the whispers would start. Could be pirates. Hope they take the captain first. Think they'd let us join? It was mostly jokes. Mostly. Some sailors kept a spare shirt, cleanest they had, just in case they were captured and had to make a good impression. Others had heard tales of crews being absorbed, traded from slavery haulers to pirate raiders. Was it better? Maybe, maybe not. But it was different. That alone made it tempting. One man kept a silver earring hidden in his socks, said pirates respected a man with silver. Another wrote a pirate code of honor into the back of his journal. It wasn't accurate. It wasn't even spelled right. But it gave him hope. There were real encounters, too. A shadow on the water. A chase that lasted hours. Cannonballs exchanged. No boarding. But the mere chance lit the crew like fire. They moved faster, spoke louder, joked more. Fear and adrenaline wrapped together into something almost joyful. Historians still argue whether this romantic view of pirates was fantasy or survival instinct. Truth is, most pirates weren't the swashbuckling rebels of storybooks. They were desperate men. But then again, so were most sailors. And for those stuck hauling chains across oceans, pirates represented something rare: unpredictability. A ship that didn't follow orders. A crew that answered to no flag but their own. So they watched the horizon, not just for storms or land, but for black sails, for lawless ships, for a chance, however small, that someone out there might tear their world apart. If the sea didn't drive you mad, the rum might. Sailors clung to their rations like sacred gifts, 1 part medicine, 1 part mischief, and 10 parts disaster. On 18th century slave ships, the daily drink was more ritual than refreshment. Rum, grog, or whatever was sloshing at the bottom of the barrelet was how time passed, how arguments started, and sometimes how sanity cracked. The standard issue was grog, watered-down rum, maybe with a splash of citrus if the ship was fancy. Usually, it tasted like something that had already been drunk once. But that didn't stop the crew from treasuring every drop. One sailor described it as the closest thing to joy out here aside from getting dry socks. Rum wasn't just for fun. It numbed pain, soothed coughs, and made bad stew seem edible. A toothache, drink. Nightmares, drink. Just saw a ghost in the hold, definitely drink. Some sailors mixed their ration with gunpowder for a stronger kick. Others fermented raisins or dried fruit to stretch the buzz. Then there was the rotgut, the unofficial brew, homemade, unmeasured, often dangerous, a mix of whatever was lying around, spoiled beer, medicinal herbs, sometimes paint thinner. One man drank a cup and started speaking fluent French. He wasn't French. Drinking games broke out regularly. Last man standing was exactly what it sounded like. Another involved spinning a knife on the deck and following the direction it pointed for truth-telling. Dares or chasing seagulls, depending on the mood. One sailor invented a game where you had to drink every time the captain cursed. It lasted 8 minutes. Of course, drink also meant danger. Fights flared faster. Accidents happened more often. One sailor lost 2 fingers trying to cheers a spinning compass. and hangovers on a rocking ship. Not ideal. The only thing worse than a pounding head was having to climb the rigging with one. Officers tried to limit the damage. Rum was rationed, water sometimes mixed in to dilute temptation. But sailors always found ways around it. Fake spills, hidden flasks, secret swaps. One crew built a false-bottomed barrel just to hide an extra stash. It was discovered when the ship hit a storm and the barrel floated upside down, pouring rum into the bilge. Historians still argue whether the rum culture held the crew together or broke them apart. Probably both. It gave warmth, loosened tongues, and softened the edges of an ugly life. But it also pulled men under, one cup at a time. And still, at the end of each long day, hands reached for tin cups, eyes closed, heads tipped back, just a sip to forget what couldn't be forgotten. Sometimes it didn't take much. A delay at sea, a cruel order shouted one time too many, a meal skipped, a storm survived, a rumor whispered too loudly in the dark, and suddenly something snapped. Boredom, fear, and exhaustion fused together, and mutiny floated to the surface. Most mutinies never happened. They existed as tension, thick and invisible, coiled in the silence between commands. Sailors gritted their teeth, bit their tongues, and waited for the voyage to end. But every ship had a line, and sometimes someone crossed it. It usually began with a whisper, a question asked too casually. What if we didn't follow orders tomorrow? Then came the private talks, hammock to hammock, quick glances, drawn-out nods, a lookout posted during meals. Someone kept inventory of weapons. Someone else counted loyalists. One man, bored and sunburnt beyond reason, stood up mid-watch and shouted, "I declare myself captain now." Everyone laughed. So did he, but he didn't put the hat down for the rest of the day. The next morning, he was tied to the mast. Still, not all signs were jokes. A broken compass, hidden tools, stolen keystiny sabotage meant to test the ship's nerves. One officer once woke up with a noose knotted above his hammock. Nothing happened that night, but no one slept well again. The enslaved, too, were part of the equation. Sailors knew that if a real uprising started from below deck, the ship could be overrun within minutes. That fear kept some officers up at night. They enforced routines, not just for discipline, but to stop coordination. The drums stopped early. The watch rotated constantly. Anything to prevent unity. Historians still argue whether most mutinies were acts of rebellion or desperation. The truth is, they rarely ended well. When they did happen, punishment came fast and cruel. Hangings, whippings, or marooning us, slow, lonely death on a nameless shore. But the idea of mutiny never vanished. It was the ship's dirty little secret, the pulse just under the deckboards, the weight behind every glare, every silence, every decision not to act. And for some, that tension became its own pastime, a fantasy, a daydream, the idea that maybe, just maybe, the next sunrise would belong to them. Landfall was supposed to be a relief. After weeks, sore months strapped on swaying wood, with nothing but salt air and screams in the hold, spotting a shoreline should have meant freedom. But for sailors on a slave ship, ports often brought false promises, empty rumors, and a deeper kind of fatigue. The approach to land was always dramatic. Shouts from the lookout, a flurry of ropes and sails, birds circling overhead like messengers from solid ground. Men ran to the sides, eyes squinting for the first glimpse of trees, smoke, or houses. One sailor wept at the sight of laundry hanging on a line. Real shirts, he said, fluttering like angels. But most ports were not what they hoped, especially in the Caribbean or West Africa, where slavers refitted, traded, and resupplied. These were working stops, not vacations. No parades, no days off, just barrels unloaded, chains checked, new goods taken on, and sometimes more souls packed into the darkness below. A few sailors got shore leave if the captain was feeling generous or drunk. But local laws varied. Some towns banned slaver crews from mixing with locals. Others allowed it, but with watchful eyes and heavy warnings. One port kept armed guards at the tavern doors. Another charged sailors extra for beer, calling it sin tax. The sailors drank it anyway. There were temptations: women, food, lies whispered in alleyways. Some men believed they could run away. One step inland, they'd say, and I'm gone. But they rarely did. The sea had already marked them, and desertion, if caught, meant branding or worse. One man did vanish during a stop in Havana. Months later, another sailor swore he saw him selling fruit in a market, dressed like a local. No one ever confirmed it. The worst part, the ship always sailed again, back to sea, back to the routines, the smell, the chains. Sailors returned to the decks quieter, shoulders lower. Land had teased them with normal life, then yanked it away. Historians still argue whether these ports helped break the monotony or deepened the despair. For the enslaved, they meant nothing, just another delay on a journey they never chose. But for the crew, they were glimpses of what they couldn't quite reach. Real beds, real food, real stillness. And so, every port became a test. A brief taste of the world they'd left behind. A reminder that somewhere out there, people lived lives that didn't creak or groan or bleed. When the voyage finally ended, when the sails drooped and the anchor groaned into place, most sailors didn't celebrate. They were too tired, too hollow, too full of things they'd never say out loud. The return home wasn't a victory. It was a quiet shuffle onto dry land, carrying memories like soaked blankets. The ship docked. Cargo was offloaded. Some of that cargo had names. Most didn't. The enslaved were marched off in chains, heads down, legs weak, eyes blank or burning. The sailors watched, or didn't. Each had their own way of pretending not to see. Then came the cleaning. Blood, vomit, salt stains. Easier to pretend it was just a long dream, or a story someone else had told. Once dismissed, the crew scattered like wind-blown papers. Some headed for taverns, others for quiet corners of unfamiliar towns. A few went home if they still had one, but something had changed. People noticed. Mothers stared longer. Friends asked fewer questions. No one wanted the details. One sailor never took his boots off, said the floor didn't feel right anymore. Another kept sleeping on the ground beside his bed, arms crossed over his chest like he was still swaying in a hammock. They didn't talk about the ship, not directly. They talked around it. The letters stopped. The jokes faded. The carvings, the songs, the rat funerals, they were over. And yet they clung to the mind like barnacles on a hull. One man carved a perfect replica of the ship from memory, then burned it. He said he wanted to watch it sink, even if only in wood. Historians still argue whether returning sailors processed their trauma or buried it. Most left no records. The few who wrote rarely mentioned names or details, just vague lines like, "The sea took something," or "The voyage was long, and the nights longer." And so life moved on, or tried to, but something lingered. Not guilt, exactly, not even sorrow, just silence, heavy, damp, always close. The kind of silence that follows you even into your dreams. Even after the ship was gone, broken up, sold off, or swallowed by the sea, something remained. Sailors spoke of a wake that never truly faded, a shape trailing behind them, even on land, an echo, a weight, a ghost. Not the ghost of one man or one moment, but the ghost of the entire voyage, the groans of wood, the click of chains, the shouts, the silence, the smell of salt and sickness and sorrow, all mixed together. For some, it haunted dreams. For others, it showed up in broad daylight, a flash of movement in a quiet alley, a shadow behind a closed door. Sailors avoided talking about it, but they couldn't avoid feeling it. It was in the way they flinched at creaking floorboards, the way they stared too long at cloudy skies. One man refused to sleep in beds with sheets. "Too soft," he said, "makes me think I'm sinking." Some turned to religion, some to rum, some to silence. One carved crosses into every windowsill he passed. Another wrote his entire journey backward, so no one could read it without a mirror. He said it was safer that way. Occasionally, you'd hear them speak about the sea, but never the ship, and certainly never about the people below deck. Their names, their faces, their songs, all packed into a part of the mind that never opened again. And yet the ghost lingered, not malicious, not loud, just present, the kind of ghost that lives in memory, the kind you carry, not the kind you see. Historians still argue whether the echoes of these voyages shaped the world that followed, whether the silence of returning sailors was part of the legacy, part of the forgetting. But some say the sea remembers, that when it's quiet enough, on the right kind of night, and maybe, just maybe, that's why no ship ever really sails alone. Something always follows, a ghost in the wake. So now the sails have lowered, the sea has calmed, and the ghosts have curled back into the wood. You made it, through the bells, the fights, the whispers in the dark, through the scraped decks and echoing songs, through the glances passed between sailors and the carved little secrets they left behind. Take a slow breath, let it fill your chest and settle deep in your ribs. Listen, not for the creak of ropes or the hush of distant waves, but for stillness, that soft kind of quiet that only comes after something heavy has been lifted, or maybe just paused. Picture the ship now, empty, drifting slowly under moonlight. Nothing but the flap of sails and the gentle hum of water against the hull. All the noise is behind you. The long days, the stranger meals, the strange friends, they're all fading behind the mist. You're here, on land again, feet on solid ground, even if only in your mind. You can let go of the rigging now. The stars will keep watch, and the sea, it can wait. Because right now, you don't need to sail anymore. You only need to sleep. Drift softly, drift slow. Good night.